Winona Ryder reveals why she never married, even after all those romances. For decades, she was seen as the woman who had everything Hollywood promised: fame, beauty, devotion, and love stories that felt destined for forever. Yet one choice never changed, no matter who stood beside her or how serious the relationship became. The public assumed marriage was only a matter of time. She fell in love openly, stayed longer than most, and even came close to the altar once. Still, every path stopped short of that final step. To many it looked like hesitation. To others, it looked like heartbreak. The truth was something far more intentional. What most people missed was that her refusal was not rooted in fear or disappointment. It was shaped by a kind of love she witnessed early in life, a standard that never loosened, even under pressure. The reason she never married is not about what went wrong in her romances, but about what she refused to lose even when the world expected her to surrender it. Before the name Winona Ryder meant anything to the world, it belonged to a girl who never expected to be seen at all. She grew up far from movie studios, red carpets, and the noise that would later surround her. Her early life was quiet, inward, and shaped by places where people watched more than they spoke. She was born Winona Laura Horowitz in October of 1971 in Minnesota and raised in Northern California in a household that did not follow the usual rules. Her parents were writers and thinkers, people who valued ideas over appearances. Dinner conversations revolved around books, history, and belief, not ambition or image. That environment made her thoughtful early, but it also made her different. School was not easy. Ryder has spoken about feeling like an outsider, the child who did not blend in, the one who noticed everything but rarely felt understood. She was shy, often uncomfortable in groups, and more at ease alone with her thoughts. While other children learned how to perform socially, she learned how to observe. Books became her refuge. Reading was not a hobby, it was a hiding place. Through stories she learned how emotions worked, how people behaved, how silence could hold meaning. Long before she ever acted, she was studying human behavior from the safety of pages. Her entry into acting was not planned. It was accidental, almost reluctant. As a teenager, she was noticed by a filmmaker who saw something unusual in her, a presence that did not ask for attention but held it anyway. There was no childhood dream of stardom. There was no sense of destiny. She stepped into Hollywood before she had finished becoming herself. That timing mattered. She had not built confidence yet when fame showed up. She was still young, still learning herself, and suddenly everyone had an opinion. There was no protection in place. She walked in as she was. Her early roles reflected that openness. She played characters who felt like outsiders, young women who were intense, sensitive, and searching. Audiences responded because she felt real. There was no performance of perfection. What people saw on screen mirrored what she carried quietly off it. Success came quickly, but it never seemed to settle comfortably on her. Even at the height of her early fame, there was a sense that she remained slightly apart from the machine that elevated her. She belonged to it, yet never fully merged with it. Before she became a symbol of romance, before her private life became public property, Winona Ryder was simply a young woman trying to stay herself in a world that moved too fast. That tension would follow her for decades, shaping not just her career, but the choices she made when the cameras were no longer rolling. Hollywood did not wait for Winona Ryder to settle in. Opportunities arrived back to back, leaving little time to adjust or refuse. What began as choice soon turned into momentum, and the rhythm of her life was no longer entirely her own. By the late 1980s, she was appearing in films that would come to define a generation. Beetlejuice introduced her to a wide audience, while Heathers confirmed that her presence carried something sharper and more self-aware than the typical leading roles of the time. These performances did not just succeed. They reshaped how young women could be portrayed on screen. The early 1990s pushed that visibility even further. Edward Scissorhands paired her with a filmmaker whose vision elevated her to cultural status, and Bram Stoker's Dracula followed soon after. Critical recognition arrived with The Age of Innocence and Little Women, where awards attention made it clear she was no longer an emerging talent. She was established. With success came constant observation. Interviews became routine. Public appearances multiplied. Her work and her image began to merge in the public eye, making it harder to separate performance from person. Every role added another layer to the story people believed they knew about her. This level of attention carried an unspoken expectation. She was expected to be available, emotionally open, and endlessly adaptable. Hollywood celebrates momentum, and stopping often reads as weakness. For someone who valued privacy, the pace demanded endurance more than expression. Despite the intensity, her performances remained controlled and layered. Audiences saw composure, critics saw depth. Behind the scenes, the demands of visibility continued to expand. There was little room to recalibrate without drawing attention to the pause itself. By her early 20s, Ryder had reached a level of fame that most actors never experience. Her name alone could carry a film. Yet the more established she became, the smaller her private world seemed to grow. Decisions that once felt personal now carried public consequence. Hollywood had given her opportunity, recognition, and a place in film history. It had also reshaped the boundaries of her life. The distance between who she was and how she was perceived began to stretch, quietly at first, then more noticeably. That growing tension would not remain confined to her work. As attention followed her beyond the screen, it would soon begin to shape the most personal parts of her life, where privacy would become harder to protect and choice would carry a different kind of weight. As Winona Ryder's career expanded, attention followed her beyond movie sets and into her personal life. By the early 1990s, her name no longer belonged only to the films she appeared in. It began appearing in headlines that treated her private relationships as extensions of her public image. One relationship in particular became inseparable from how the world saw her. Her romance with Johnny Depp unfolded at the height of both of their fame and quickly became one of the most visible pairings of the era. They were young, famous, and intensely scrutinized. Photographs of them circulated widely, and their appearances together were treated as cultural moments rather than personal ones. Their relationship carried a seriousness that set it apart from casual Hollywood dating. They became engaged, and the symbolism of that commitment captured public imagination. Depp's tattoo declaring Winona forever turned their relationship into something mythic, a visible promise that suggested permanence. For many observers, marriage felt inevitable. Yet the very visibility that fueled fascination also stripped away privacy. Their connection unfolded under constant observation, with little separation between genuine emotion and public expectation. What might have been navigated quietly became something discussed openly, analyzed and anticipated by strangers. When the relationship ended in the early 1990s, the aftermath played out just as publicly. Depp altered the tattoo. Headlines moved on. Ryder did not offer spectacle or explanation. She returned to work, maintaining composure while the world processed the story without her input. This pattern would repeat, though never in exactly the same way. Ryder continued to form meaningful relationships, often long-term, often serious. These were not fleeting encounters. She stayed, invested, and committed in ways that contradicted any narrative of avoidance or instability. Still, each relationship existed alongside an expectation that followed her closely. Questions surfaced again and again. Would this be the one? Was marriage next? The assumption lingered that time and seriousness would naturally lead to the same conclusion. When it did not, speculation filled the gap. What is often overlooked is how young she still was when these expectations solidified. Ryder entered highly public relationships before she had space to define what permanence meant to her on her own terms. The pressure to translate personal connection into public milestones never fully receded. Despite that pressure, she never framed her relationships as failures. She did not retreat from intimacy. She did not dismiss commitment. Instead, she continued forward, choosing connection while declining to perform its most traditional outcome. As the years passed, her approach remained consistent. She valued depth over display and longevity over momentum. Relationships were lived, not marketed. When they ended, they did so without public campaigns or rewritten narratives. Later in life, she would reflect on being a serial monogamist, a phrase often misunderstood. It did not signal restlessness. It described a pattern of staying, of choosing one person at a time, fully, rather than scattering attention. The label mattered because it countered the assumption that her unmarried status reflected detachment. The contrast between her devotion and her refusal to formalize it became harder for the public to reconcile. To many, marriage remained the ultimate proof of seriousness. Ryder's life offered a different picture, one where commitment existed without ceremony. Through it all, she rarely defended her choices publicly. She did not correct assumptions or redirect narratives. Silence became its own boundary. In a culture that demands explanation, she offered continuity instead. By the time she reached her 30s, Ryder had lived much of her romantic life in view of others. Love, expectation, and scrutiny had intertwined repeatedly. What remained unchanged was her refusal to let public pressure define private decisions. The story was no longer just about who she dated. It was about how she navigated visibility, commitment, and choice without surrendering control. That tension, built quietly over years, would eventually lead her to articulate something she had understood long before the world asked her to explain it. By the time Winona Ryder began addressing questions about marriage directly, the assumption had already hardened. Years of long relationships had convinced the public that marriage was simply overdue. When it did not happen, curiosity turned into judgment, and speculation filled the silence she maintained. When she finally spoke, her explanation was measured and deliberate. She did not frame marriage as something she feared or rejected outright. Instead, she spoke about divorce and about what it represented to her. She said she would rather never have been married than be divorced a few times, clarifying that divorce itself was not wrong, but that she did not believe she could handle it if marriage were entered without certainty. Those words shifted the conversation, though not everyone listened closely. What she described was not avoidance, it was restraint. Marriage, in her view, carried weight beyond ceremony or social expectation. It was a promise meant to last, not an experiment meant to be corrected later. This perspective did not emerge suddenly. It had been present for years, quietly guiding her decisions even as outside narratives suggested otherwise. While others measured commitment by milestones, she measured it by endurance. Marriage was not something to be reached eventually. It was something to be protected until it could be honored fully. Her stance stood in contrast to the culture surrounding her. Hollywood often treats marriage as a marker of stability, a public confirmation of success. For women in particular, it becomes part of the expected arc. Ryder did not fit that arc, and she did not try to reshape herself to match it. What made her explanation easy to misunderstand was its simplicity. There was no dramatic turning point, no singular heartbreak that pushed her away from the altar. The absence of a clear catalyst led many to assume something must be hidden. In reality, the reasoning was consistent, not reactive. Over time, Ryder acknowledged that her parents' long marriage shaped her standards. Watching a relationship endure for decades made impermanence feel heavier, not easier. That example raised her expectations rather than reassuring her that love could be replaced. Marriage to her was not symbolic. It was definitive. This belief created an internal boundary that did not depend on who she was with. It existed regardless of romance, timing, or public opinion. She did not rule out marriage in theory. She refused to approach it without conviction. As the years passed, that boundary remained intact. Relationships came and went, each carrying meaning, none crossing that final threshold. The consistency of that choice suggests intention rather than indecision. It was not that she kept changing her mind, it was that her mind had already been made up. Ryder never framed herself as a victim of expectation. She did not position her choice as a statement against tradition. She spoke quietly, directly, and without apology. Marriage, she made clear, was not owed to anyone else. What emerged from her explanation was a portrait of someone unwilling to treat permanence casually. In a world that normalizes endings, she held on to the seriousness of beginnings. That distinction mattered more to her than fitting into a narrative that never quite matched her life. By articulating her reasoning, she finally brought language to something she had practiced privately for years. The choice not to marry was not about fear or loss. It was about honoring a promise she believed should only be made once. That clarity marked a turning point, not in her life, but in how her story could finally be understood. The question was no longer why she never married. It was whether the world was ready to accept that her definition of commitment had never wavered. As the noise around her life slowly softened, Winona Ryder entered a different chapter, one defined less by visibility and more by balance. Fame was still present, but it no longer dictated every rhythm of her days. What changed most during this period was not her career, but how carefully she guarded what mattered to her. Away from headlines and speculation, she formed a long-term relationship with fashion designer Scott Mackinlay Hahn. Their partnership unfolded without spectacle. There were no public announcements, no staged moments meant to reassure anyone watching from the outside. It existed quietly, and it lasted. They were together for years before many people even realized it. When she did speak about him, her words were simple and grounded. She described feeling lucky. She spoke about stability and mutual respect. The absence of drama became the story itself. This relationship did not follow the familiar arc expected of her earlier romances. There were no countdowns, no questions about rings or timelines. The pressure that once followed her seemed to dissolve, replaced by something steadier. Privacy, once difficult to protect, became a shared value. What stands out about this period is how little explanation she felt compelled to give. She no longer framed her choices in response to outside curiosity. She lived them. Marriage was not revisited as a question because for her the answer had already been settled. At the same time, her career experienced a quiet revival. When Stranger Things premiered in 2016, audiences met a version of Winona Ryder shaped by time and restraint. Her performance carried depth that felt earned. She was no longer defined by youth or intensity alone. She brought history with her. The renewed visibility did not pull her back into old patterns. She appeared grounded, reflective, and selective. The chaos of early fame had given way to discernment. She worked when projects resonated. She stepped back when they did not. In interviews during this later period, her tone shifted. There was less urgency, less need to defend or define. When asked about her life, she spoke with acceptance rather than explanation. The choices she made no longer required justification. Her long-term partnership remained outside traditional labels, yet it carried everything people often associate with commitment: consistency, loyalty, care, time. The absence of marriage did not signal absence of devotion. It simply reflected a different arrangement. What her story offers, especially in retrospect, is an expanded definition of fulfillment. Love did not need to follow a script to be real. Stability did not require ceremony to be valid. For Ryder, peace arrived not through conformity, but through alignment. As she moved further from the years of constant scrutiny, the narrative around her softened as well. She was no longer framed by what she had not done. She was seen for what she had sustained. In choosing a life shaped by intention rather than expectation, Winona Ryder arrived at something quieter than the ending many anticipated. Not a dramatic conclusion, not a public declaration, just continuity. Her story does not resolve with a wedding or a revelation. It settles into something steadier, a life lived deliberately, with love present, boundaries intact, and no apologies required. That, in the end, is the choice she kept making, even when no one was watching. Winona Ryder's story never followed the outline people expected, and that is precisely why it continues to resonate. For years, her life was measured by what had not happened, rather than by what quietly endured. The absence of marriage became a question, even as her commitment to love, work, and self remained consistent. What her life reveals, especially with time, is that fulfillment does not always arrive wrapped in tradition. Some paths are shaped by intention instead of milestones, by restraint instead of performance. Ryder did not reject love. She honored it in a way that felt honest to her. In an industry that rewards visibility and conformity, she chose privacy and alignment. She protected what mattered, even when it meant misunderstanding. That choice, repeated over decades, became its own kind of legacy. Her story invites a different way of looking at success, especially for women whose lives unfold under scrutiny. Not every love story ends at an altar. Some arrive at peace instead. For more emotional stories, check out this video.